Hi everyone, this is the brief review video on ideas, the theme ideas for Units 1 through 3. Units 1 through 3 cover from 1492 all the way up to 1800. This is the time period where we have European settlement in the Americas, establishing colonies, and also the time period where the British are going to see their colonies rebel, form a new country, which includes first an Articles of Confederation and then a constitution, all the way up to Jefferson being elected. So let's talk about ideas from these three units. If you look all the way over to the left on our timeline, you have the 1500s, starting 1500 to 1750. We really see one major ideas, especially that Europeans have as they encounter peoples in the Americas, and they also encounter Africans, is their view of Native Americans and Africans is just going to perpetually become worse and worse. And we're seeing the foundations essentially of racism in these early time periods as they subjugate Native Americans in the Americas to mine silver in Bolivia and Potosi and other areas. And you're also bringing over Africans to grow sugar, tobacco, and other major cash crops. And you can see this also through letters that have been written, most notably letters like Bartolome de las Casas. I'm not going to talk more about it, but you can see down here 1530 Sepulveda versus de las Casas. Bartolome de las Casas is a Catholic monk, and he is writing about Native Americans and the horrible treatment thereof and how they need to be converted to Catholicism. Sepulveda is basically talking about how Native Americans need to just basically be killed off. And for the most part, they are being killed off by disease. But these notions of Europeans being separate, better, having a more sophisticated system of technology, government, way of life, etc., is really being fermented in this time period as Europeans are encountering peoples different from them in the Americas and establishing slavery in the Americas. At the same time that that's happening, especially amongst the Spanish and the French, we're seeing intermixing of peoples, and this helps us to establish groups of people called the Atlantic Creoles. Creoles are people who are of mixed ancestry. They might be part Native American, they might be part African, they might be part European, and they are able to, if you're an Atlantic Creole, that meant that you were able to speak multiple languages, that you could speak English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Native American languages, African languages, not necessarily all of those together, but some mixing of languages. You see a mixing of culture in these the Atlantic Creoles. And based on that, the Atlantic Creoles have a kind of sophisticated view of different groups of people, and different ideas are emerging, blending of cultures are emerging, and that's establishing new ideas amongst different groups in what will become the United States. We're really talking about people who are enslaved, who might be Atlantic Creoles, who have a more sophisticated view and less narrow-minded, tunnel vision view of different groups of people. You're also seeing different ideas establishing in both Jamestown and also in New England. In Jamestown, you have this notion of Jamestown being established for business and making as much money as possible. That helps to develop a sense of individualism, each for his own in Jamestown, as opposed to creating this community view that we're really seeing in New England with the Puritans trying to establish a perfect Puritan society where they're looking out for each other. They have a social contract with each other. They're establishing schools. They are trying to be an example of how God would want the world to live in their Puritan community, as opposed to that individualism of Jamestown. You have the starving time in Jamestown, and while certainly you're going to have some hard times in Puritan New England, you're not really going to have that same sense of each for his own self, specifically that we're seeing in Jamestown. Also, in this early colonial time period, we're seeing the influence of Enlightenment ideas as well as Great Awakening ideas. The Enlightenment is coming out of Europe. It's philosophical thinkers and writers, people like John Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau. These men are writing ideas about freedoms that we should all have in government, the notion that government should have checks and balances and have division of power in government. In the Enlightenment ideas are also coming up with the notion that if the government's job is to protect the rights of the people, and John Locke says that all people should have the right to life, liberty, and property. And it's the government's job to make sure that all people have equal access to those things. And if the government isn't doing its job, the people have the right to overthrow that government and establish a new government. And that helps to establish ultimately the Declaration of Independence and our new form of government. The Great Awakening is a religious notion and a religious belief that all people should have equal access to God. In Great Awakening meetings, you see people meeting outside in the open air where everyone can hear the preacher speak, and how everyone is equal in the eyes of God. The Great Awakening is not just for wealthy men, it is for women, it's for African Americans, it's for anyone who's willing to listen and to be basically accepting God and accepting what God wants you to do. And so the Great Awakening is primarily a religious movement, but it also helps to establish a sense of egalitarianism and egalitarian approach to religion that lends to ideas being formed in government, and also challenging the authority of government, because the Great Awakening is essentially challenging the established church that had been set up in places like Puritan New England. Another idea that's coming about in this time period is the notion that in the colonies you have some sense of toleration of other religions. Maryland, specifically in 1649, is establishing the Toleration Act, which meant that even though it is established essentially as a Catholic colony, that it would tolerate other Christians. It wouldn't tolerate other faiths, but it would tolerate people beyond the Catholic Church. So that sense of tolerating other people and tolerating other religions is starting to develop in this early colonial time period. Also, from the 1640s to 1700, we are really starting to see indentured servitude shifting more and more towards slavery. Bacon's rebellion helps to lead in that shift. Bacon, remember, is not an indentured servant himself, but he leads an army of indentured servants to go to the capital of Virginia, Jamestown, overthrow the governor who manages to escape, Governor Berkeley, and take over the government and potentially take over all of Virginia. Ultimately, that rebellion is put down, but it puts a lot of fear in the minds of people that indentured servants are potentially a dangerous group once they gain their freedom and get land out west if they feel like their needs are not being met, which Bacon really did not feel like the government was doing its best to protect those indentured servants from Native American attacks out west. And so we're switching more and more in this time period from the late 1600s to 1700 to race-based slavery more and more being used for labor as opposed to indentured servants. And by the time that we get to the 1700s, that becomes the dominant labor force. That's a new idea. Another idea, getting back to things leading us to the revolution, is Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. It's that pamphlet written in the beginning of 1776, which brings about the idea that we shouldn't try to get representation in Parliament, but instead we should form our own country. That leads to the American Declaration of Independence. And that's one of our ideas behind the revolution. Once we gain our independence, what we're really starting to see when we see the Articles of Confederation is this notion of what type of government do we want. The type of government we established under the Articles of Confederation is really one where the states have more power than the federal government. And we also established our kind of government ideas behind American Indians in 1783 under the Articles of Confederation. We're going to see those notions really coming about in government acts. And when George Washington is president, he actually establishes, after the Constitution's established, but George Washington sets up laws that deal with how we treat Native Americans. It's called the Indian Intercourse Act, which makes it so that the government is the only entity that can interact with Native Americans, and it has to be in certain posts or certain places, trying to keep those American people separated from Amerindians. It's very different from what the Spanish and the French have always done with Amerindians, which is intermixing and intermarriage with Native Americans. Another idea from this early republic time period is the notion of what is the role of women as we establish a government where people can vote and participate. So Republican motherhood comes out of that. The notion that women's job is to be educated so that they can educate their sons to be virtuous citizens of the new republic, vote, take part in government, and women should be educated so that they specifically are going to educate their future sons. We see new ideas specifically in with the new types of political parties. The Federalists having the notion that we're going to establish a government where we have pro-business policies and we have more control in the central government. The Democratic Republicans are essentially trying to establish this notion of agrarian republicanism, and everyone's going to be a yeoman farmer, is going to be educated and take part in democracy. Last major ideas on here have to do with what is the role of the states versus the federal government. Virginia and Kentucky resolves or resolutions specifically speak to that when we have this notion of the Alien and Sedition Acts being unconstitutional. So Jefferson and Madison in 1798, in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which essentially say that the states, if they feel like a federal law is unconstitutional, can call it unconstitutional, and gives that power back to the states. That's an idea that's going to really be a problem for this country until we get to the Civil War. The notion of who should have more power, the central government or the states. And the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions really push the notion that the state should have more power than the central government. So that's it for this particular timeline. Again, I hope this finds you well, and I look forward to talking to you guys soon. Bye-bye.